Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our panel on creating safe spaces for trans youth. My name is Janice Cajigas. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the producer at the New Haven Pride Center. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. The New Haven Pride Center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Sha- Shattuck, Golden Hill, Pagasutt, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac peoples. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you occupy and the history of the place you are in. To learn more about Native lands, please visit nativeland.ca. Today's event is part of the New Haven Pride Center's Trans Day of Visibility programming, which hopefully you've been joining us past days and will continue to join us for the rest of the week. We also wanted to take a moment to thank all of the incredible sponsors and donors who make the work of the New Haven Pride Center possible. Anna, we have with us Savannah, Erica, and Cleo. Hey, loves, how's everyone doing? So we'll get started with a quick round of intros, and just have you all introduce yourselves, your work, and then share with us a favorite quote of yours. Who would like to get us started?
I could go. I'll be the sacrifice. Hi everyone. My name is Erika. My pronouns are she, the ella. I am a community organizer based in Connecticut. Currently working with the ACLU. I'm a singer-songwriter, activist, and organizer. And a quote. A quote is by someone named Chelsea Cleveland. I don't know if we're allowed to cuss on here, but I can bleep it out if need be. It was actually during like this kind of interview process, and I remember saying I'm crying and feeling things, and they were like, bad bitches cry too. And that has stuck with me forever, and so I keep that present.
I'll go next. I'll go next. So Davina here. Nice to meet all of y'all. She, her. Um, I currently work for no one but myself. um, with myself right now. That's a fancy way of saying unemployed.
Not broke.
I am going to college right now. I am a UConn student, class of 2024, political science major. Finding out ways to change the world little by little, you know. And a favorite quote of mine is actually by Laverne Cox, which she says, let me see if I remember. It's on my Instagram bio too. Um, I got you right now. I've never been interested in being invisible or erased. Yes.
Thanks, y'all. I'm Ra or Sarana. My pronouns are they, them. Sorry, I'm doing good today. What were we supposed to say besides the quote?
The work you do?
Oh, thank you. So I'm with the Connecticut Black and Brown Student Union. I'm a youth worker, an organizer, a mama, a painter, poet, a writer. And I guess a little bit of a space cadet. Sorry, y'all. And one of my favorite quotes is by Sun Ra, and it's "The impossible attracts me. Everything possible has been done before, and nothing has changed."
Thank you all. And Cleo actually joined us last year for this very same conversation on this very same day. So thank you for joining us again. So let's jump right into it, right? The very first question is, why are safe spaces for trans youth so important? And I would love to start with Erica.
Whew, okay. Why are safe spaces important for trans youth? I think it is central to like survival, right? To be in a space where you are seen and there isn't the necessity to over explain your existence and your humanity, but to just simply exist within it and that be enough is important. It's vital to like their survival. It's vital to our survival. And I think, right, like spaces inherently we have to fight for. And especially the work that we all do, like we're trying to create these spaces that we didn't have access to before, or that we totally weren't allowed to have access to. And so again, just reiterating that it is like, and it needs to be centralized in like what we deserve to have access to. And it's also about building a sense of community with folks that you see yourself in. And I think like that's the work that keeps me going, and like that's the space that I need. So
Who would like to go next?
I'll go next. As someone who is now going into adulthood, I find it very important thinking back as to the fact that I needed trans spaces where I could really fully be myself. If it wasn't for the work that I was doing at such a young age, with organizing and working in legislation and all these things, I wouldn't have been able to feel comfortable with my identity. Like I said, I was here last year. Last year, I was here as a non-binary, they, them, serving us, goddess, and now I'm here as a trans woman. And I wouldn't have been able to come to the conclusion that this is who I am, you know? And it's so important to have those spaces, because when we don't, we continue to create and cater to an environment and a climate of confusion where youth grow up and they're like, I don't really know who I am. And when they get into this adulting phase where they're like 18, 19, 20 years old, where the world tells us we need to get our life together, they're like, but I don't even know who I am right now, you know? And if we were able to have these spaces and say, we're going to create these spaces for people, we wouldn't have that constant confusion in our generations.
Thank you.
That made me a little emotional.
mm-hmm.
I was just so eloquently put, both of y'all. And I have the privilege and honor to have worked with or still work with all of you. I'm just really humbled by what was shared. For me, it is the same reasons that I build spaces for all young people. It is the literal living future. It is the living, breathing future that it is our responsibility to cultivate. And when, what Cleo was just sharing about what is lost when we erase queerness, really, I have felt so deeply in my own life, as somebody who has come into my own space of gender understanding and fluidity later in life. I think constantly about what was lost for me in heteronormative, like compulsive heterosexuality, right? And binary gendering. So yeah, that just really landed for me. But then there are just all of the ways that the real realities of trans youth being so multiply marginalized that they are facing, literally in our world, some of the highest rates of all of the inequities we talk about for all of our communities. So when we talk about an intersection, there we are. And so that it from a literal, Erika mentioned survival, right? From a literal tactile safety and care standpoint is crucial.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. Um, as trans youth, finding community is often hard, um, and rare to come across. So I'd like to hear a bit about how have you been able to find community? Erica, within the work you do, Cleo at a university, a huge university, how have you been able to find folks to find comfort in, and spaces where you're comfortable enough to fully live your true self?
I had to make them. In reality, that's the reality that we have as trans women, sadly. We have to create those spaces. We have to create those groups of people in our little tribe, our little village that we feel we can be welcomed in. Currently, right now, I'm in the works of creating a Black Student Union at my school because we don't have one. Um, you know, and they just created a queer club. We didn't have one. These things are things that we've had to create because none of these spaces were there before we got here. Mind you, I go to UConn Stanford, which is more diverse than Stores, and yet we still didn't have these spaces. So in reality, the sad truth is constantly where we go, no matter where we are constantly having to make those spaces. And I hope that at some point in this life that we don't have to and that the spaces will already be there. But for right now, to be quite honest, I had to create those spaces for myself where I can feel comfortable. I had to establish myself and say, this is who I am. Whoever has a problem, feel free. The door is over there. You can leave. And whoever wants to stay, stay. And, embark on this journey with me. But other than that, that's all I could do. And that's really all the power I felt that I
Whew. Yeah, that really resonated with me. I think the truth be told, right, like the anxiousness that I feel is because thinking about how being a trans woman and how that intersects with being Indigenous and Black, like show up in like organizing spaces, like a lot of trans folks and the work that they do is like really erased in this field, and it's not centralized in a way. We're actually makes me a little emotional, like where it's really erasing the work is what I'm trying to say. And I think like I think about how in terms of trying to create a space where like I'm like living my truth, like in a sense, like there's a trustingness of myself, like having to bet on myself and bet on that I can make it and I can do it. And there's also the other half where like I am scared all the time and I don't actually know if this is going to work out or not. Like I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I am willing to bet on my identity. I'm willing to bet on my community that every time, every step of the way, that no matter what happens next, like I'm okay with it. And like, I think in terms of community, like it's really been a hard path to try and navigate on like really defining what does community mean to me as a trans woman in these spaces, and like what does it also look like for community to show up for me, and what does it look like for me to choose a community but for them to choose me back, and that has been actually extremely crucial in the spaces that I've been trying to cultivate. And so it's really about intentionality, and it's also about like just being willing to try over and over again, in ways that I'm honoring my safety, but also honoring that like I can't do this alone. And so being willing to trust people is a part of that. And so I have slowly just built a community of folks that and like in the spaces I mentioned, right? Like my identity doesn't have to be questioned or over explained, but it is who I am is enough. And like being a queer person, I'm like, I just want queer people around me all the time. And so just making sure that that's present, because it don't hit the same when there's not other queer folks in the room.
That community choosing you back piece definitely hit for me. Like it's so important. The following question would be, we know that there's a lot of similarities between non-binary folks and trans folks, right? And we know that oftentimes our experiences are very similar, but at the same time, our experiences are very different. And you know, as trans folks, we live completely different lives than non-binary folks do, and we face different struggles in our own journeys, right? Um, but then very much is like our besties when it comes to the whole community. So I guess my question is for folks who have shared about like, you know, you all have had to create your own spaces and create spaces for trans youth. Um, how do you do that when community often conflates both non-binary and trans folks? Like, how do you create spaces intentionally for just trans youth when often the narrative is that like non-binary folks and trans folks are one and the same, when we know very much our realities are often very different?
That's a good question.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I feel like what comes to mind in terms of like creating those spaces, I just think like it's again about like how are we centralizing things outside of ourselves, and things that also include us. And like I remember also too, like I like was going on a journey of like myself, and without that space of being able to identify who I am, like I was like, yeah, I'm a they them flower, and like that, you know, and then having the space to also then find myself and, you know, what actually aligned with me. I think it boils down to safety, and safety is a scary word to kind of say because like safety looks so different, and what safety looks like to me might be different to you. But I think it's, if I'm trying to connect it back to like the organizing work and like the ways that we're trying to craft the space, I'm like, I think it just boils down to intentionality and and how we're protecting each other and allowing folks to show up as themselves and also be willing to show up in the journeys that they're in, and being able to say like, I am if we, even if folks don't understand or don't have an understanding of what something is, but allowing folks to feel safe enough to say, this is what I'm exploring and this is where I am on my journey, and that's holding that space to say, we are here to hold it with you. And I feel like that's important, and centralizing that.
Thank you.
That question still got me.
You know, I just feel like this is not my lane, right? So I just don't have a lot to add, right? But what just comes up for me is, you know, trans folks need to hold trans, you know, only spaces, so that what the determining what safety is can be held, you know, specifically. And I've heard this conflation as well. People are all over the map on this idea. I've definitely had, you know, people tell me non-binary people are also trans. And for me, it just kind of hits home with a lot of my identities are not visible, or to me, it's akin to, you know, myself. Yes, being Black and then being light skinned, and also knowing sometimes it's just spaces that are just for Black folks, visibly Black, you know, folk. And so those spaces are just I think sometimes folks might possibly read them as exclusionary, but they're just required. They're a requirement for people that are most violated, most marginalized in our society to just determine that and do what they need.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Cleo, do you have anything to add before we move on?
I honestly, I feel like the spaces that we create as trans women, as trans men, as people who are part of the trans community, um, is specific for trans people. I feel like a lot of times people will say that maybe we're trying to invalidate the existence of the non-binary people by saying, hey, you're not, you can relate to us in some way with our battles that we go through every day, and some, but you don't fully go through the trans experience. You don't fully go through that experience. So I feel like honestly, the way I was trying to comprehend the question was almost kind of like with Black and white spaces, right? Where Black people at a certain, well, even now, we create spaces and we're like, we don't want no white people here. We don't want no white people here. And it's not that we want to exclude. It's more or less you can be allies to the community, you can be there for us, stand for us, relate in some way to some of the things that we may go through, but you can't fully dive into this sector or what this community or this space that we're trying to create because one, we want a community, a little village of just trans folks that can relate to one another and can be a network and help to one another. But obviously, you can be an ally, you can help, and by being an ally, would be to say, okay, that space is specific for trans people. Kind of like what Rob was saying with, visibly Black folks and stuff like that. To be an ally would mean that you would be able to recognize that space is specific to trans folk and say, okay, I'm gonna go and create my own space for non-binary people, or create a space where non-binary and trans people can come together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think to echo that, right, just like I think that also shows up in writing, like if like we mean we care, like if we mean like what we say about community care, I think that also means like opening the space to ask like what do we want these spaces to look like and what will be most beneficial and like what feels safe, what like trying to find like what folks need, I think is important. And I think like we can't decide without like actually asking folks who are primarily impacted and actually exist within those identities, right? Because some folks might feel seen in this particular space and or might need another, but like that's not for us to dictate this or that. And I think like it's again, if community care is supposed to look like a thing where communities are coming together to decide what care looks like in this moment for each other, like we got to have the conversation to ask and like take a step back to listen.
Also, it's making me think of what is required of like our greatest like creativity, expression, brilliance, like those things need a sense of security and safety, right, to flourish. And so without those spaces where you're like arriving with a little bit of a guard down comfort, like, okay, these are my folks, we have this very specific shared experience. Like, what will be lost in those spaces if that real specific clarity and direct intention isn't like stated,
Absolutely. Thank you all. So Rob, this question is for you. As someone who I consider a veteran organizer in the state, right? We know, like Erica mentioned earlier, like queer organizing in Connecticut is basically non-existent. And even more organizing that centers trans folks, right? So, in your opinion, as someone who is an OG in this work, what do we have to do or should be doing to shift the field and the narrative?
Okay. First of all, I'm so flattered to just be called an OG and loved by y'all, and so I'm beaming a little bit, but from that, because I feel if you're serious about your work, you're always learning. So I feel like I'm always like, what's going on? So I'm just honored to be thought of that way. You know, I'm at a point where specifically over the last few years, how we've done this work, or how I understand it, has been so spun. So I feel in like a deep transition in some things. I always go back to training. I think, and this is boring, and nobody, wants to specifically talk about skill building and rigor and training, but I really do believe that there is a responsibility and a requirement to be very intentional with where we document our work, with who we pass it on to, right? And so I think of, when I'm thinking of leadership development, I'm not thinking of my organization. I'm thinking of how we exist in a field of young folks who are coming through many organizations, much mentorship. And I think we are lacking around building really training and rigor spaces that are intentional with who is asked to hold the space, but also really building strong organizations so that we're building positions of power to leave to people, right? Like, I care about the BBSU's strength and viability for my succession, right? Like, I'm looking at y'all to be the leadership in the coming years, in the coming decade, right? And so I tend to think of things like 10 years down the line in that way. Where will we be, and how will we have built an actual process for leadership, skill building, and employment for you all throughout the field? Can you ask me the question again so I can see if there's something I missed? Just that last part.
Yeah. How do we shift the field to center more of like the trans and queer organizing?
Y'all got to hold the spaces. It's the same thing as just youth work. How do you make it youth led? You got to just make it youth led. Like, the youth just got to show up and lead it. And so we just need folks being intentional around mentorship, training, and like possibilities for facilitation, leadership, leading spaces, right? For trans women, trans young people. Like, that is just a matter of where we are putting our energy and our resources.
Erica, Cleo, anything to add?
Just over like echo Ross said, and I think, I think like when we're not centering, trans experiences like in the organizing spaces, like a lot of what is lost is safety. And I think like when we're planning actions, right, or like, and actions can mean different things, but what is lost is when we're not critically thinking about intersectionality in those moments, we're not thinking about who could potentially be the most harmed. And so we're thinking about protests and stuff and showing out on front lines, which a lot of the times visible Black trans folks are at the front lines of those things, right? I have seen, right, like how we're not thinking about, well, what happens when they're arrested? What happens afterwards? Who do they have? Like, none of us are doing that, like, critical thinking. And so I just really appreciate what you said, Rob, because my mind goes there about what is lost and like then like what happens next. And people aren't actually prepared for that. And that's like what scares me. And so like the spaces have to like be held.
Yeah. Whew. Yes. Just feeling that so hard, because if you are not doing that part, it's just exploitation. You're just literally putting people in danger. And actually, the BBSU started calling these biweekly meetings when really George Floyd was popping off, Breonna Taylor, the beginning of COVID. My heart was in my throat for all of the Black youth, Black trans women, queer people that were going to immediately, because we know who shows up, be at the forefront and in danger. And this is just so important to hold, because if you are not putting a foresight around the safety and the planning and the, you just put people in danger. And that's why I'm so specific about the differences between mobilizing and organizing, and how we bring these things full circle to bring people back into an actual cycle of care, of, okay, who's checking on who. I could go on about this forever now. You got me worked up, but yeah, just so feeling that. Yeah.
Thank you all. Cleo, anything to add?
I'm just echoing everything Var and Erica said. Like, this is why Var's the OG. You see the way she thinks, her way her mind, the way they mind words, sorry. Like, it's just amazing to me. But also just recognizing the fact that trans women and trans men have been leading many of the movements that we in the first place are standing up for, that we in the first place are even fighting for. Um, like with the queer movement, many people didn't start recognizing it was our girl Marsha P. Johnson that was out here in the streets throwing the first bricks. You know, a lot of times Black trans women, Afro Latinx women, all these different various of people start these movements, and we don't give them the recognition that they deserve. So we can't have trans-led spaces and spaces for trans women and that are led by trans women, spaces that are led by trans men, if we don't give them the recognition that they deserve. Because just as much as we give cis heterosexual men, you know, and cis women the recognition that they deserve, and we're like, oh yeah, she deserves her praises, he deserves her praises. What about ours?
See that. So this is more of a policy question, and we'll start with Erica since you're at the ACLU. Um, but what policies do you think should be enacted, or like change makers should be paying attention to, um, that would help aid and create safer spaces, safe communities, and overall a safer Connecticut for trans youth?
Okay, my stomach got heavy. I've been thinking a lot about this question, and a few things like stand out to me. So when I think about like my experience, right, when I was coming up as one of the younger dolls, trying to just figure out what's what, and during my research phase, right, like I remember I would come across a lot of things where like what felt very progressive for Connecticut essentially was very different for other places, right? So relatively, it was easy for me to change my name, but in another state, some trans folks couldn't even get seen to change their name, right? So I think it's important to understand like how policies are showing up, like what access looks like, and particularly in your state, in order to like accurately like support other trans folks in their journey, depending on where they are in the state. Because like sometimes what my access looks like may not be what is accessible legally to another trans person. So I think that was something that I really took away. So when thinking about that, that makes me think about safety and harm. And so I don't know what this would show up in like policy, right? But I do know, right, like trans folks, the last time I looked at that, are like 2 to 3 times more likely to experience workplace violence, right? Are more likely to experience homelessness, right? When we look at the youth homeless rate on a nationwide thing, but specifically in Connecticut, it's predominantly Black queer young people, and predominantly of that is Black trans young people. And so when we're thinking about like police and all the things, there's something really sinister about what happens when harm is happening, and we don't know where our young people are at, and like they are not actually investigating them as their proper and respected name. And so I don't know how that would show up in a particularly like legislative way, but there's something there that like is really scary to me. And so like it's the invisible of the deaths that are happening that like intentionally institutions are erasing and dropping cases on and not paying attention to because they know that they are trans or of a trans experience. And so that is something that like is a state of emergency, and like it is contributing to the epidemic on our lives. And that is like where I really want to start, because that trickles down into, again, workplace violence. When what happens, right, like there are no systems in place right now to adequately support and protect trans folks. And so to sum it up, that's where my mind goes. Like that's where we need to really pay attention, and like where I would like to see something happen. And we're like organizing, what's happening in around these areas.
Ra or Cleo?
I actually recently had a conversation about policy or things that can be done by state governments, even our United States government, regarding trans youth. And a lot of times we talk about homelessness, but something that I was finding recurring was that when trans youth are kicked out of their homes for simply being trans, or when trans people are out on the streets, the first thing that we see a lot of times is resorted to find money is sex work. So, and sex work is illegal and, bans and in certain states and whatnot. So how can we, like Erica was saying, create safety for trans people, create that safe space where trans youth can go to and not feel like they have to resort to doing something that the state is going to be like, we're putting you in jail. And it's your body, you do what you want. But at the same time, let's also be safe so we don't end up in prison. And there's more than the percentage of the United States population that we have of trans people in prisons. Just like how 60-70% of the prison system is made by Black and brown people. And there's only 13% Black people in America. We don't want that. And that's something that we see reoccurrently, where a lot of trans youth homelessness leads down to that path. So how can we, pass policy or organize in a way where we can make sure that trans youth don't have to go through that, don't have to end up in that system and possibly, go to prison, and then when they get out, still revert back to that because that's the only life that they know. And I was having this conversation with a friend, and I was like, how can we do that? How can that be made? Well, first off, pass policy regarding work discrimination, also pass policy where there's in schools, they don't go ahead and report, hey, listen, we know you kicked your daughter out, your trans daughter out, but they're at our school, and the first thing that they do is when they see that there's a child that is at a that's been kicked out of home, is call mom, call that. You don't know if the parents are the same ones that kicked them out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Call mom, call dad, and then what? They end up being beat. They end up in distraught. They end up seeing more trauma that they already have. So let's actually build places where there's safe havens for trans, where if they're kicked out, they can go to and not know shelter where they sleep on mats and they have little blankets here and there. Like, no, we need safe havens where trans youth can go to if they've been kicked out of their homes and they have nowhere to go. Because these trans youth are getting kicked out of their homes and they don't feel like there's a life out of that. The life that they once had is now all stripped away from them simply because they decided to be their true selves. Safe havens where trans youth can still go to school, build themselves a career, and seek higher education or seek whatever it is that they want, their dream and aspirations, and not feel like they have to resort to sex work because it's the easiest and fastest way to build money.
This question is so huge, and these answers are so important. I appreciate how grounded they are, because I feel we're in a moment in social justice where everything is like a theory, a concept, like, oh, like, put it on Instagram, and like people's needs are material. They are tactile. And I hear this conversation from people a lot, like, oh, I don't want to fight their way, talking about policy change or systemic change. You are so selfish. I don't want to hear none. You are full of it, because you should be here concerned with making the most change, the most impact for people that never know your name, not somebody finding your project or that can't be what it's about, because people, it's hard. We have so much culture shift work to do just to create safety and relationships and visibility and basic stuff, right? And, the reality is people's needs are everything. Cleo was just saying, I just think about the housing so much, right? Just basic access to employment that is sustainable, that, supports you, food, healthcare. And those are policy issues. Those are material needs. It's not like a concept like, can we all feel good here? And I think those places where we become oriented to like, oh, like, how good does it feel? Like, this is hard work. It is hard work. We are pushing against a system that literally is clearly like, I hate you and I hope you die. It's not fun or sexy a lot of the time, but it is required. It's our responsibility. And so I just feel so grateful in grounding this whole conversation in that, because it's unpopular right now to do this work. Is seen as somehow like less radical or something to make the changes for everybody. So I'll get off but yeah.
What you won't go do is make me cry. What you won't do is make me cry out my Rare Beauty mascara from Selena Gomez. I just really quickly, that like really just hit me in terms of just like get it together is really what I want to say. Like, I really want to be like, get it the fuck together. Sorry who's watching. Like, I have to say that, like the time that we're in, like, I just I've had to turn off my phone just thinking about like all of the discourse, and I'm like, my trans body and experience is not your political playground. And like, and I think about like in 2020, I lost my healthcare. Like, there was so much loss that I had, and right, thinking about what I still have access to, and still how greatly I was affected by loss. And then I had COVID on top of that. Like, I couldn't even call a doctor. And then when I was able to like maneuver and start my hormone replacement therapy, like, I couldn't even afford it, dog. Like, my temporary insurance from the state was for a month, and I had to wait to get it in the mail, my card. So I had 2 weeks to book appointments and to get my shit. And on top of that, it wasn't covered. I'm like, folks are not needs are not being met, y'all. And while you're sitting here trying to play morality tag, like people are dying and not having access to what they fucking need. And like that is what feels so frustrating to me. Like I am tired of sitting in spaces where we're talking in circles and biting each other's tails. Things need to get done. And so it's just like it's just really frustrating. So I just appreciate you saying that. Like that, it just really hit home, and like that particular thing has just like triggered me in my fight or flight mode the last like 2-3 weeks. Like I have been so anxious and exhausted. Like I just have been like, I don't trust any of you. I don't trust any of you to handle any conversation that is related to me and others that share a shared experience. To like further advocate and organize for my life, for our life. I don't trust you. And like that trust is fundamental in like us co-working in this intersectionality movement. And like it's continuously being broken. And so it's just like that. I think like that's a lot of the starting ground is like trust is broken. And like yeah. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you all. Yes, there's so many stuff that I'm like, yeah, we need a quote book started. What's this happened? It was cute. Our final question to close us out is specific to those who call themselves our allies, our co-conspirator, as I prefer to call them. But how could our co-conspirators and allies help support and center the experiences and voices of trans youth and predominantly cis spaces where we ourselves may not be in them?
I would say, I think what shows up for me is like, and it goes again like hand in hand with other spaces, right? Because, but you gotta learn when to like step away and take a step back. I think is extremely important, and it also looks like, right, like y'all need to start like in terms of like trying to show up and be an advocate for especially the spaces that we're particularly not in, and you are committed to like showing up for us, like that means those conversations also happen at the dinner table with your grandpa papa. Like it starts there, right? It's not just with the people that you can easily just delete on Facebook, but it starts with the people in your home that like have a shared mentality and belief system that contribute to a deep sense of harm that is trickled down into policy. It's trickled down into physical and emotional violence. They're not disconnected. And like it starts there. And so and that to me, like you have to also be appointed, how I see it, as someone that I trust to show up. And that's a deep commitment. And that also means you have to be committed to learning and also unlearning what you thought was right, because the needs change all the time. And the basis of something will shift all the time. And so I think it's important to me that like reading about it and having a degree in something is not enough, and it doesn't make you the expert. You have to just be committed to that. And yeah, that's what I have to say to be concise.
Cleo?
For me, it's really, don't talk about an experience that you do not know about. You see a lot of people who claim to be allies, especially in our work as organizers, who say, I am a trans ally, I stand up for trans women, I stand up for trans men, I stand up for intersex people, I stand up for non-binary people, and talk about all these experiences and things you do not know jack shit about. I don't know if we can curse, I'm sorry. But you don't. And they'll sit there and they'll feed people lies. They'll sit there and speak for us because they think the trans women don't have a mouth of their own and that they can't speak for themselves. And they're going to speak for us because they think that that's what allyship is. It's not. It's not. What allyship is, if you see a trans woman talking about her experience, you're going to sit down and you're going to listen. Because And then also halfway in while you're talking, they'll interrupt you and say, but this and this. No, don't interrupt my experience either. Don't interrupt my experience either. You know, people can ask questions, but also don't question my validity as a woman either. Um, if you want to be an ally, you want to support the trans community, don't speak for us. Let us speak for ourselves. But also, stand up for us when it's needed. You'll be able to see. Because if you really are about the life of organizing, really are about activism, really are about allyship, you'll be able to see with your own eyes when it is time for you to stand up, when it is time for you to speak up, when it is time for you to do your voice. But if you see a trans woman doing her thing and defending herself, why are you going to butt in? It's like minding a business that's not yours. Don't talk about an experience that's not yours. That's something that I feel like many cis people need to know, many queer people in our community as well, because you see a lot of gay men, a lot of gay women talk about these experiences that they've never had. And yes, we are all a part of the queer community. We're all queer here. We are all gay and proud. We are all rainbows and sunshines. But at the same time, we all have our own different experiences and our own different things that we go through as the separate labels that society has given us. Where it's like hierarchy, where you have trans women at the very bottom of the line. They draw the line at us. Everything else is acceptable. Where you see even gay men are transphobic. Gay people are the most transphobic people, and yet they call themselves allies. Do not call yourself an ally and speak over me, and do not call yourself an ally and draw the line when it comes to me, and say, "I'm sorry, this is not drag night."
Yeah, I always say you can be an ally or co-conspirator without claiming my oppression.
Yeah. Yep.
To Cleo's point, I asked one of my daughter's friends about these questions when you sent them to me. She is a trans young woman in high school right now. And if it's okay, I'm just going to share her answer. She literally just texted it. So she says, personally, as a trans woman in high school, I only feel safest with my close friends that accept me. And when I'm around people that are known to hate on the LGBTQIA community, I feel anxious and scared. Seeing trans women being hurt is traumatizing to the community, and we have to be cautious at times. We can use social media as a way to group together trans people and allies around the world to spread the word and communicate with each other to break this narrative. And we should teach kids and teens in schools on how it is being trans in today's society and not judge us for being who we are.
Thank you. Thank you for
That's
sharing.
the organizer right there.
It
The organizer right there.
was giving.
Yeah, that's from Justine, who's a close friend of the family. And she was so happy to be asked and be able to share. So
That was beautiful.
This has brought us to the end of our time. I would like to thank every single one of you for being here, and being able to be a part of this lovely conversation. It's always an honor to share space with you all. To those in our community watching through Facebook and YouTube, thank you for joining us and watching us virtually. I encourage folks to come out tonight to the Trans Day of Visibility meetup and Trans Night Out, which will start here at the New Haven Pride Center, and to engage with us April 27th for the Trans ID Clinic at 6 p.m. here also at the New Haven Pride Center. And thank you all so much, and see you all next time.
Thank you, Jenny.